The English coast was cold that night, a restless kind of cold that crept beneath uniforms and clung to bone. Along the shingle of Sussex, dim lights flickered under canvas as thousands of Canadian soldiers prepared in silence for an operation whose purpose none of them fully understood. Trucks growled in the distance, engines coughed awake, and officers moved through the darkness, whispering final instructions. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally so, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Most of the men had trained for months, expecting something monumental. Yet no one dared to name the fear that settled upon them now. They only knew they were leaving before sunrise and that the target was occupied France. Beyond that, mystery hung over the entire mission. Private John Fraser from the South Saskatchewan Regiment sat on an ammunition crate, tightening the straps of his gear while trying to hide a tremor in his hands. His friend Charlie Dunn knelt beside him, checking the magazine of his Sten gun. Charlie forced a smile and said, almost jokingly, that whatever waited across the channel would not dare stand up to thousands of Canadians landing at once. John managed to nod, but he had read the looks on officers' faces all week. Something about this raid was different. There were too many short briefings, too many late-night changes, too many maps shown only to be taken away moments later. It felt like they were marching toward a secret none of them had been allowed to see. In an operations hut nearby, commanders gathered under a single dim bulb. A large map of the French town of Dieppe lay pinned to a table, its chalk outlines marking defenses, cliffs, gun emplacements, and the narrow beach that curved around the waterfront. British officers spoke quietly about armored support, air cover, and the timing of each landing craft. A Canadian brigadier stood by the window, listening without interrupting, his jaw locked. He knew morale was fragile, and any hint of uncertainty could crack the men before they even left the shore. Yet he also knew the truth. The intelligence was incomplete, the German defenses underestimated, and the plan had changed too many times to inspire confidence. But orders from above had been clear. The raid was necessary, even if few agreed on why. Officially, Dieppe was a test. Britain needed to learn whether it was possible to seize and hold a French port temporarily. Some believed it would show the Soviets that the Allies were serious about opening a second front. Others insisted the raid would provide invaluable lessons for future landings. But there were whispers of something deeper. Certain units had been assigned odd objectives involving coded materials and radar installations. A select group of intelligence officers had arrived at the last minute, slipping aboard ships without speaking to anyone. Their presence alone suggested the mission held a hidden layer, that most of the men marching up the gangways would never be told. By midnight, the battalions began boarding the landing craft. Boots clattered on metal ramps, equipment rattled, and voices bounced in sharp echoes through the night. The men of the 2nd Canadian Division filed in under the watchful eyes of officers who pretended this was routine. When a corporal asked a question about German patrols, he received a terse reply that avoided details. When another soldier wondered aloud if tanks would actually function on a pebble beach, the officer brushed it off as if conditions were irrelevant. Confidence was essential, and doubts were being crushed beneath ritual discipline. On the deck of one transport ship, a chaplain moved among the men offering quiet words and short prayers. He kept his tone steady and warm, asking about families and homes, knowing full well that some of these young faces would never see those places again. A few soldiers clung to photographs tucked inside their tunics. Others stared at the dark horizon where the sea and sky blended into one shapeless void. One sergeant paced back and forth, rehearsing hand signals, Another cleaned his rifle so obsessively that his squad joked he would polish the barrel right through to daylight. The laughter was thin, but it kept their nerves from fraying. Just after 2 a.m., the ships pushed off from the coast. The men felt the familiar lurch as the vessels rode the waves, carrying them into the unknown. Wind whipped across the decks, scattering loose papers and chilling exposed skin. Many sat shoulder to shoulder in silence, conserving warmth and courage. A British naval officer stepped into the hold and announced that the flotilla would arrive before dawn. He reminded them of their timing, of the importance of the element of surprise, and he assured them that the Royal Air Force would be overhead. The words seemed rehearsed, as if they were meant more to soothe than to inform. Charlie leaned close to John and whispered that he had a bad feeling. Not about the fight itself, but about the way everyone seemed to be pretending nothing was wrong. John did not answer. He stared at the black waves swirling outside the craft and wondered whether the Germans knew they were coming. It was impossible to shake the suspicion that this operation had been rushed, that too many decisions had been made far from the men whose lives depended on them. Yet none of that mattered now. The engines were roaring, the sea was carrying them forward, and the point of no return had passed hours ago. On another ship, farther toward the rear of the formation, a small intelligence team sorted through sealed envelopes. Their mission files contained instructions written in terse language, describing communications equipment to seize and documents to retrieve from a German command post near the port. The officers worked quietly, careful that the Canadian infantry sitting nearby could not see the contents. One of the intelligence men looked at his partner and murmured that if the raiding parties reached those buildings at all, it would be a miracle. The partner replied that miracles were rare in war, but the information they sought could change the entire Allied understanding of German defenses. Their task, buried inside a larger operation, was the kind that would never appear in press briefings. The channel grew rougher as the flotilla pressed on. Waves slapped against the metal hulls, sending spray across the decks. Several soldiers began to feel the creeping dizziness of seasickness. Officers reminded them to stay alert, to stay focused, to keep weapons secured. Someone shouted for a medic when a young private fainted from nerves. But the medic simply helped him to his feet and assured him that fear was normal. The private nodded weakly and returned to his bench with trembling legs. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the hum of engines and the occasional burst of radio chatter. The moon hid behind a blanket of clouds. Every man sensed the moment tightening around them, pulling them toward something immense. The air smelled of salt and exhaust and tension. In the darkness, a colonel spoke quietly to his adjutant about the screenshots of reconnaissance photos they had been shown briefly days earlier. He said the cliffs around Dieppe looked far steeper than the planners admitted. The adjutant replied that there was no turning back now. At roughly 4 a.m., a sudden burst of gunfire erupted from the direction of one of the flanking groups. Tracer rounds streaked across the water, lighting the night in sharp bursts of orange. German coastal patrols had spotted part of the force. Radios crackled with urgent voices reporting compromised landings. The news traveled quickly through the ships, carried by whispers and worried stares. Charlie clenched his jaw and muttered that the element of surprise was gone. John felt the fear in his gut harden into something cold and heavy. The British naval officer returned to the hold, this time with a more urgent tone. He instructed everyone to prepare for an accelerated landing. The diversionary forces had been engaged too early, and the main assault would now face alerted defenses. Soldiers began readying equipment. Cartridge belts snapped into place. Helmets were tightened. Knuckles whitened around rifle grips. The roar of the engines intensified as the flotilla pushed harder toward the French coast. Through a break in the clouds, the outline of the French shoreline appeared. Dark cliffs rose against the faint glow of the approaching dawn. The men gazed toward the coast and saw nothing welcoming in its silhouette. It looked hard, jagged, and indifferent to whatever fate awaited them. The town of Dieppe lay beyond those cliffs, still hidden in the half-light, but its defenders were no longer asleep. John felt the landing craft tilt as it veered into formation. He turned to Charlie and said, in a low voice, that whatever they were about to face, they would face it together. Charlie nodded firmly. Around them, men braced for orders, for gunfire, for the moment the ramp would drop and the world would erupt. The flotilla surged forward, the gray outline of dawn beginning to spread across the sea. Radio screamed with last-minute instructions. Officers barked commands. Machine guns on escort ships scanned the shore. Far ahead, German searchlights flickered to life. The men did not know the full truth. Not yet. They did not know that this raid was part experiment, part diversion, part intelligence hunt, and part political signal. They only knew they were minutes from landing on a hostile beach. The mystery that had followed them for weeks was tightening around them, preparing to reveal itself in fire. As the first shells arced from the cliffs and burst over the water, the soldiers lowered their heads and waited for the inevitable. The raid had begun, and nothing about it could be undone. The dawn over Dieppe was no longer quiet. It was the beginning of a storm these men had never been told to expect. The first wave approached the shore as dawn finally broke over the cliffs of Dieppe. What should have been a muted gray morning turned into a blaze of light as German machine guns opened fire from the moment they saw shapes moving across the water. Long bursts sliced through the rising spray, cutting across the landing craft with a terrifying precision that proved the defenders had been waiting. The men inside the boats crouched low as bullets hammered against the metal plating. Officers shouted above the noise, trying to keep order, but their voices were nearly swallowed by the thunder of German guns echoing through the narrow harbor. Private John Fraser felt the craft shudder violently when a shell exploded in the water beside them. Charred fragments cut into the wooden benches. The man beside him fell forward without a sound, and John barely had time to pull him back before another burst tore across the bow. Charlie Dunn gripped John's arm and yelled that they needed to be ready the second the ramp dropped. John nodded, though his stomach twisted at the sight of the French coast looming closer. The beach was not sand. It was jagged stone, smooth pebbles stretching across the shoreline and up to the seawall like a field designed to break every step they took. A naval officer yelled for everyone to brace. The landing craft scraped against the pebbles and ground to a halt. The ramp slammed open with a metallic crack. Light flooded inside, followed instantly by a barrage of machine gun fire so intense that the first men who stepped forward were cut down before they reached the waterline. Shouts filled the air, muffled by the roar of weapons and the crashing surf. John and Charlie leapt out, stumbling into waist-high water as bullets whipped across the waves. They forced themselves forward, slipping on the stones, teeth clenched against the shock of cold and fear. Around them, dozens of Canadians struggled through the surf. Some crawled to avoid machine gun fire. Others dragged wounded comrades behind the limited shelter of smoke from burning landing craft. A tank rolled off another craft nearby, but sank almost immediately, its heavy tracks swallowed by the soft seabed. More tanks attempted the same, grinding onto the stones only to lose traction. Their treads spun helplessly as German gunners zeroed in on them. Armor that was supposed to provide shelter became twisted wrecks within minutes. The Canadians pushed forward anyway. There was no cover except the seawall, and they had to reach it or die where they stood. John ran until his lungs burned, diving behind a mound of pebbles just as a burst of machine gun fire tore through the space he had occupied seconds earlier. Charlie slid in beside him, panting, face streaked with seawater and ash. He kept his voice low and said they needed to move before the Germans adjusted their aim. Together, they dashed forward again, hunched low, slipping on the stones until they reached the base of the seawall, where dozens of soldiers had gathered in a desperate attempt to regroup. German fire rained down from reinforced positions built high into the cliffs. Machine guns swept the beach in deadly arcs. Mortar shells detonated along the shoreline, sending showers of rock fragments into the air. Officers shouted for wire cutters, for grenades, for anyone who could find a gap in the wall. But every attempt to scale it was met with brutal resistance. Engineers tried blowing gaps with explosives only to be cut down before they reached their targets. A squad attempted to mount scaling ladders, but the wood shattered under gunfire before anyone could climb. John heard a lieutenant yelling that they needed to push left toward the casino building, where a small number of troops had managed to breach part of the seawall. Charlie pointed toward the smoke drifting near the structure and signaled for them to move. They crawled along the base of the wall, pressed flat against the stones as bullets ricocheted overhead. When they finally reached the partial breach, they found a group of exhausted soldiers huddled under the rubble, exchanging fire with Germans entrenched in upper windows. Inside the shattered casino, dust and plaster filled the air. The old gaming tables were splintered wood. The slot machines were reduced to metal skeletons. Everything echoed with the crack of rifles and the thump of grenades. A corporal directed John and Charlie to take positions near a blown-out doorway. They leaned against the wall, rifles ready, waiting for a break in enemy fire. Charlie whispered that this was worse than anything they had imagined. John agreed silently. Outside, the sound of German artillery intensified. More landing craft approached the beach, only to be struck by heavy fire before their men could even disembark. The bodies of soldiers floated in the surf alongside twisted pieces of wreckage. Medical teams tried to pull the wounded to safety, but the kill zone left them exposed with every move. The sea itself seemed coated in tragedy, washing back and forth against the stones, carrying fragments of uniforms and gear. In the casino ruins, the Canadians tried to push deeper into town. They advanced room by room under ferocious pressure. Every street leading inland was blocked by barricades or swept by machine guns positioned in upper windows. German snipers fired from rooftops. Their fire was precise, confident, and unrelenting. The Canadians fought back with determination, but they were outmatched in both elevation and preparation. The town had been transformed into a fortress long before the raid ever began. Somewhere near the waterfront, officers received the grim news that flanking units had also suffered catastrophic losses. The men landing at Pourville and Puys were pinned down as badly as those at the main beach. The supporting commandos struggled to reach their objectives through thick resistance. Radio operators struggled to communicate as static filled the channels. Confusion spread through the ranks. No one seemed certain whether the next wave should land or retreat. Orders shifted rapidly, reflecting the chaos that now defined the morning. John and Charlie pushed forward through the casino's upper corridor, stepping over shattered glass and broken beams. They joined a group of soldiers firing through the windows. trading shots with Germans entrenched across the promenade. Smoke drifted over the boardwalk, casting long shadows in the rising light. John spotted movement near the hotel across the street and called it out. A sergeant directed fire, forcing the Germans to pull back momentarily. It was only a brief reprieve. More Germans arrived moments later, tightening their grip on the town center. A sudden thunderous blast rocked the entire building. Dust poured from the ceiling as part of the casino wall collapsed under artillery fire. John and Charlie were thrown to the ground. Ears ringing, they scrambled to their feet and looked for survivors. A number of men were down, some unmoving. Medics rushed in, shouting for help, pulling the wounded toward the rear of the building. Charlie grabbed John's arm and pointed toward the beach. Smoke and fire now shrouded the shoreline. Even from the casino, they could see waves of men still trying to land under brutal machine gun fire. It was clear the raid was failing. Commanders inside the casino attempted one final push toward the town square, hoping to break through to the inland roads. They formed a small assault group and ordered John and Charlie to assist. The men climbed through a shattered side door and spilled onto the promenade, keeping low as bullets erupted around them. They sprinted toward a ruined storefront where smoke offered partial cover. As they reached the doorway, a German machine gun opened fire from an upper balcony. The assault group scattered. Several men fell instantly, struck before they could find shelter. Pinned down, John knew they could not advance any farther. The German defenses were too dense, too prepared, and too high above them. A captain crawled behind a low wall and shouted to his men that they had to fall back. The priority now was survival, not breakthrough. The Canadians pulled back toward the casino ruins, dragging the wounded as they retreated. The once hopeful assault had been reduced to a desperate struggle for escape. By mid-morning, the situation across all landing points had become catastrophic. German fire dominated every approach. Air support proved unable to neutralize the entrenched positions. Tanks remained stuck on the beach or destroyed near the waterline. Communications were deteriorating. Soldiers were running low on ammunition. Medics were overwhelmed. Officers debated whether to continue the operation or evacuate. The cost of every minute grew higher. The beach was becoming a graveyard. John and Charlie regrouped with their company near a crater behind the seawall. Their faces were gray with dust. Their uniforms were torn, soaked, and streaked with blood. John caught his breath and wondered how many of their battalion were still alive. Charlie wiped grime from his eyes and murmured that they needed to get off the beach before the Germans encircled them completely. Then the order came. It crackled over the radios and was shouted across the ruins. The raid was to be halted. Evacuation would begin as soon as possible. The men looked at one another, stunned but relieved to hear the impossible finally acknowledged. Yet the retreat would not be simple. The Germans still held every vantage point, every fortified position, every weapon aimed at the shoreline. The Canadians steeled themselves. They had fought with courage, with determination, and with a sense of duty that no level of planning failure could diminish. Now they prepared for the most dangerous part of the raid. They had to escape under the same fire that had devastated their landing. John tightened his grip on his rifle and looked toward the burning shoreline. The path to survival was narrow and unforgiving. Behind him, Charlie muttered that they still had a chance if they moved fast. John nodded. The deadliest hour was not over. The beaches of Dieppe were about to claim even more lives. Smoke drifted across the ruins of the Dieppe waterfront as the order to withdraw rippled through the shattered companies still fighting for survival. The Canadians who had survived the landing were scattered in pockets of resistance, crouched behind rubble, overturned carts, burned-out vehicles, and collapsed walls. Many had long since lost track of their officers. Others fought under the direction of sergeants or corporals simply because they were the last men standing with enough strength to shout an order. German machine guns continued to sweep the beach relentlessly. Mortars thumped overhead. The tide washed up over bodies and fragments of equipment, pulling at boots and helmets like a grim reminder that time was running out. Private John Fraser crouched behind a ruined concrete block with Charlie Dunn pressed beside him. Both men were breathing in sharp, ragged gasps. Their faces were coated with soot, and the salty tang of blood and smoke clung to the air around them. John looked toward the beach where the landing craft were beginning to circle back in, trying to rescue whoever they could. The evacuation would be every bit as dangerous as the landing. Charlie wiped sweat from his eyes and said they needed to move before the Germans tightened the noose completely. John nodded, though his legs felt heavy with exhaustion. As they prepared to run, a young lieutenant they barely recognized stumbled toward them, his sleeve torn, his face streaked with dried blood. He shouted over the gunfire that intelligence teams needed support near the seawall. They had retrieved documents that had to get back across the channel. Charlie exchanged a quick look with John. Neither understood why intelligence officers were here on what was supposed to be a coastal raid. But they followed without hesitation. The lieutenant pointed toward a cluster of men gathered behind an overturned cart. Among them were 2 British intelligence officers clutching a metal case dented from shrapnel. German fire intensified as John, Charlie, and the intelligence group moved along the seawall. Bullets chipped away concrete inches from their faces. Mortar blasts shook the ground beneath them. A sergeant barked commands for smoke grenades. Thick white clouds billowed, giving momentary cover as they sprinted across the open ground. One of the intelligence officers stumbled when a bullet grazed his leg, and John hauled him back to his feet. Charlie fired bursts from his Sten gun to keep German heads down. They moved like men balancing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one misstep meant not pain, but silence. When they reached a shallow depression near the waterline, the lieutenant signaled for them to stay low. He radioed frantically for a landing craft to divert toward their position. The intelligence officers opened the metal case and checked the documents inside, their faces tense. Inside were pieces of German coding materials, observations from captured communications equipment, and notes from a failed attempt to reach a radar installation near the cliffs. It was clear the intelligence mission had been far more critical than the infantry had ever been told. John stared at the papers and felt anger rising beneath the shock of battle. They had stormed a fortress for this, for something the ordinary soldier never knew existed. The lieutenant ordered them to move again. German fire was growing heavier as more defenders arrived along the cliff line. A machine gun opened up from an upper rooftop, forcing the Canadians flat against the ground. Charlie whispered that the mission looked doomed. John gritted his teeth, determined not to die on a beach that had already consumed so many of their comrades. When the lieutenant called for a final sprint to the water's edge, they obeyed. They burst from cover and ran across the stones as bullets kicked up shards at their feet. The landing craft roared toward them, its bow gun firing in controlled bursts. Sailors waved frantically for them to hurry. The intelligence officers clutched the case to their chests. John felt his legs burning and his lungs screaming as they neared the surf. Just as they reached the water, a mortar round exploded behind them, sending a wave of heat and debris over their heads. Charlie stumbled but regained his footing. They splashed toward the boat as the sailors reached down to pull them in. John collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath. The intelligence officers slid in behind him, one still clutching the dented metal case. A sailor shouted that they were pulling away, and the craft backed up under a hail of bullets. Spray drenched them as the engines roared. John looked toward the beach and saw Canadians still pinned against the seawall, still fighting for every inch. Some waded into the water, waving desperately for rescue. Others continued firing until they were overrun. The sight carved itself into his memory with a sharpness that exceeded pain. As the boat sped away from shore, Charlie leaned against the railing, staring at the burning ruins of Dieppe. He kept his voice flat, almost hollow, as he said that no one would ever understand what happened here. John did not answer. He felt the same cold emptiness settling over him. The raid had been sold to the men as a test, a trial, a limited assault meant to gather experience. But what he had seen in the casino, what he had witnessed with the intelligence team, and what he had already begun to suspect suggested a truth far more complicated. When the landing craft reached the larger transport ships, medics rushed forward. Wounded soldiers covered the decks, some moaning in pain, others lying eerily still. Officers moved among them, taking quick counts, compiling casualty numbers, and trying to piece together what remained of their companies. The intelligence officers disappeared quickly into the ship's interior, metal case still in hand. The lieutenant who had led them saluted John and Charlie before limping away toward the infirmary. John watched him go and felt a surge of bitter admiration for a man who had kept his mission alive while the world fell apart around him. As the ship pulled away from the French coast, John stood at the railing watching Dieppe shrink into the distance. Smoke curled into the sky. The cliffs stood dark and indifferent. The beach was still alive with gunfire. He wondered how many men remained trapped on that shore, how many would be taken prisoner, how many would never return. Charlie joined him, silent at first. Finally he spoke. He said the raid would be questioned for years, maybe decades. No soldier on that beach would ever forget what he had seen. But few would ever learn why it happened the way it did. Hours later, as the wounded were tended to and the dead were counted, officers held muted discussions in the ship's briefing room. The intelligence materials were laid out on the table, damaged but intact. They contained precisely the kind of information Allied intelligence had hoped to gain since early in the war. German radio frequencies, communication protocols, and notes that could shape future operations. The documents were vital, but they came at a cost so immense it weighed heavily in the room. Some officers argued the intelligence was worth the loss. Others looked at the casualty reports piling on the table and said no information could justify the deadliest day in Canadian military history. Word spread quietly among the ranks. The theory that the raid had been intended to gather intelligence grew stronger as men overheard snippets of conversation from the officers. No official statement was made, no explanation offered. But the truth settled into the minds of the survivors. They had taken part in something larger than a mere test. They had been pieces in a plan built far above their pay grade, a plan that had gone terribly wrong. When the ship finally reached England and the wounded were carried ashore, crowds waited in silence. Nurses and volunteers offered blankets and warm drinks, but no amount of kindness could erase the devastation etched into the men's faces. Families and reporters waited anxiously for news, but the returning soldiers had little to offer. Their stories were chaotic fragments of fire and stone, courage and tragedy, and a mission that seemed wrapped in secrecy. John and Charlie stepped onto the dock, both limping slightly, both carrying invisible weight. They had survived, though neither fully understood how. John stared at the horizon and felt the sting of knowing that so many of their comrades had not. Charlie exhaled slowly and said they needed to tell the truth someday. John nodded. But he also knew that history would take time to catch up with what had happened on that beach. It would take years before analysts pieced together the decisions, motivations, and intelligence goals behind Dieppe. Some details would not emerge until long after the war. In the days that followed, the surviving Canadians were gathered for debriefings. Officers asked questions about German defenses, landing conditions, weapons placements, and enemy tactics. Many soldiers answered mechanically, still numb from shock. Some spoke with anger barely contained. Others refused to speak at all. The grief hung thick in the air, accompanied by the unspoken acknowledgement that the raid had been a disaster from the moment the first boat had touched the stones. Rumors circulated among the survivors, whispered in barracks and infirmaries. They spoke of the failed attempt to seize German coding material, of special radar equipment targeted by commandos, of a deeper purpose hidden beneath the official story. No one knew which parts were true, but the men who had carried the metal case across the beach offered a clue. The secrecy of their mission cast a long shadow. It suggested that Dieppe had been less about capturing a port and more about prying open the German war machine, even at terrible cost. Weeks later, John and Charlie visited the graves of their fallen comrades. They walked among the rows of white markers, each one a name that had once laughed, fought, trained, and dreamed beside them. Charlie read the inscriptions quietly. John stood still, unable to speak. The cemetery was serene, a peaceful contrast to the chaos of the raid. But the silence cut deep. He realized that the truth of Dieppe would always be twofold. It was a story of courage and sacrifice beyond measure, and also a story of a mission cloaked in secrecy, designed for reasons far above the heads of the men who bled on the beach. Standing among those graves, John understood something he had not been able to grasp in the heat of the raid. Dieppe had revealed more than intelligence secrets. It had shown the cost of war in its most brutal clarity. It had exposed the gap between strategic ambition and the lives of ordinary soldiers. It had forced a reckoning within the Allied command that would shape their planning for the rest of the war. And when the time finally came for the Allies to return to France on D-Day, many of the lessons learned at Dieppe would guide them toward a different fate. As John and Charlie walked back toward camp, the wind carried the faint hum of distant aircraft. The war was far from over. But they carried with them the memory of a raid that would haunt their generation. A raid whose true purpose would remain shrouded in debate long after the last shot had been fired. Dieppe had been deadly, tragic, heroic, and mysterious. It was a story that refused to rest quietly, a story that demanded to be understood no matter how many years passed. Behind them, the cemetery stood still in the late afternoon light, rows of markers gleaming white against the green. The men who lay there had paid the price for a mission they were never fully told. The truth of Dieppe was not simple. It lived in layers of sacrifice, secrecy, and revelation. And as long as people sought to understand what had happened on that August morning, the hidden mission behind Canada's deadliest raid would continue to emerge, piece by painful piece.